Welcome to Grid Talk. My name is Tom Downey, and today we are here to discuss the news that Gianpiero is leaving Red Bull Racing and heading to McLaren for the 2028 season. Joining me today, we have my good friends and co-host, Miss Ruby Price.
Hello.
Hello there. And Mr. Owain Medford.
Hey.
Hey. So, first of all, we will just get some initial reactions for GP leaving, as it came as a bit of a shock. So, Ruby, I will come to you first. What was your initial thought when you read this news?
I thought it was fake news, which in this current F1 news cycle wouldn't really be that far-fetched, to be honest. Like, if there's one thing I think that comes so alien, it is the thought of Gianpiero Lambiase not wearing Red Bull colours. Of course, you know, he's incredibly linked to his own driver that he race engineers for, Max Verstappen, and there's a lot of talk about him wanting to leave, and we might get to that a bit later, but, you know, Gianpiero Lambiase is part of the furniture at Red Bull. You know, he's a very senior member, has been basically since he came along from Force India, I believe, back in 2015, and became Danny Kvyat's race engineer, and then obviously was Max's race engineer from 2026 onwards. But it was just surprising. Like, obviously, there's been a lot of people leaving Red Bull recently. It's a continuation of a lot of that key personnel going. You know, Horner, Helmut, Wheatley, Newey, Marshall, Shack, not Slack, just to name a few people. But yeah, Gianpiero Lambiase not sat on that Red Bull Racing pit wall from 2028, I believe, is when the contract starts, the very least. There'll be gardening leave and all that other fun stuff to talk about too. But yeah, it's just a surprise, I believe. You know, came out of nowhere, surprising that it's actually real, but part of another trend that we've seen, which is potentially worrying for Red Bull fans.
Yeah, and as a Red Bull fan, worrying is one way of putting it, indeed. Owain, what was your initial thought when we saw this news break the other day?
I mean, essentially, it was just, you what? You know, I can only give it in the form of an outburst, really, because similarly to Ruby, I was just like, there's no way that was happening. I mean, the way that the news was broken is the way I'll say that. It didn't seem like it was coming from the usual sources. It's super odd. I think it was on a podcast. So we've come a bit full circle here. Because of that, I mean, it just doesn't seem kind of real. You know, as Ruby said, the GP's been there basically as long as, you know, kind of as long as you can remember. You know, there's this kind of, those engineers that are there and you're just like, oh yeah, they've always been there. You know, he's been at Red Bull for what? I think this will make it his 11th year with the team, obviously engineering Max for all that time. So he's become a voice that we're used to hearing in the same way that, you know, Bono is or Toto is, you know, that you forget there was a time that you weren't hearing him down the radio. I think it's indicative of maybe something that's going on at Red Bull. You know, this has been happening for a while now. It's not the first. So when you sit and sort of think about it, it's maybe not so surprising to see that, you know, people are moving around. There's a sort of a changing of the guard going on. And, you know, I hate to bring it back to business, but ultimately Formula One is a business first, whatever anyone likes to say at this point. And you can always tell when a company's sort of changing tack or is not maybe going to be going in the right direction when executives start to leave. They're the people with the most visibility. They're the people with the most foresight into what's going on. And, you know, they know when, you know, they know when headwinds are coming and when to jump ship. So I'd say that the sort of plethora of you know, high profile departures that we've seen, more than just people being poached, is maybe indicative of what's really going on at Red Bull. And I think GP is just maybe the latest in a long line of that.
Yeah, there's definitely an exodus which is just keeping on happening at the moment, and Red Bull need to do something to stop the bleed, stop the brain drain, whatever you want to call it, from that team. This does bring us on to our second point. Speaking of people potentially leaving, what does this mean for Max Verstappen? Because he's been at that team since, 2016 in the senior team. Is he going to stick around? Is he going to leave? You know, there are so many questions about what it means for Max. So, Ruby, I'll come to you first. Again, you know, Max has got a lot of interest outside of F1. He has a young family. You know, he's spoken about stepping away from the sport when it feels right. We know his views on the current regulations, plus the Red Bull car is apparently quite badly overweight. What does this mean for him in the future, with his contract being up, I think, at the same time as GP's?
Yeah, Max's contract, as far as I'm aware, is currently up until the end of 2027, but there is obviously this talk of there being an exit clause or a performance clause where if he's not second in the Drivers' Championship by a certain point, he's allowed to trigger that in order to force a leave from the main team. And obviously he finished the Japanese Grand Prix and was making a lot of comments about whether he actually had any interest in remaining in Formula One at all. Obviously came off the back of doing some GT racing, which apparently he's quite good at it. I didn't watch the race. It's not necessarily one of my interests, but apparently he's quite good at it, despite a DSQ for having a car that was under or overweight, one of the two. And obviously he is a vocal critic of the current F1 regulation cycle and has said on several occasions he does not enjoy the current formula. He doesn't consider it racing. It's too focused on energy management. So maybe there's been a conversation between the two of them, and this departure for GP Gianpiero Lambiase is coming as a result of Max Verstappen saying, I don't want to be part of this team anymore. So GP, as his career with Red Bull for the last 10 years has been so in support of Max, has thought, okay, well, now it's time for me to go and find another venture, another avenue, which is McLaren. Maybe Max would follow him to McLaren. I don't think that's as likely as, we're seeing talk of Mercedes rooting around. I think any team on the grid would be incredibly lucky to have Max Verstappen racing for them, but they'd have to be prepared, if they are not fighting at the front, to receive a lot of criticism from him, his entourage, retinue, his fans. He could take a break from Formula One, do the old hiatus and come back. I believe Mika Häkkinen's been due a return to Formula One now for about 20 years. But, he enjoys things outside of Formula One. He has a new family. His priorities may have shifted as well. I said it in our review of the Japanese Grand Prix, though. If Max Verstappen wants to influence Formula One, he has to stick around in the world of Formula One, because once you leave it, it's incredibly difficult to make it back.
Yeah, definitely. And you made some very good points there about Max having a lot of influence in a team, and if the car isn't right for him, or if he was to join a team, if he did stick in F1, a team would have to expect some backlash. He will definitely have some avenues open up for him. We saw Toto obviously trying to court him last year, which didn't come to anything, and Max signed that contract extension. I wonder what his thoughts are about it at the minute, but I guess we'll never know. Owain, what do you think Max will do next year? Do you think he'll stick around? Do you think he'll go? Well, sorry, not next year, but when the GP leaves Red Bull, because Max did say in a Dutch interview, I believe it was, in the end of the 2021 season, that if GP was to leave, Max would also leave F1. Ruby alluded to it, where this could be both of them sort of leaving, but we only know of one at the minute. What do you think he will do in his future?
I hesitate to call his bluff, but it's kind of the side I'm sort of landing on in terms of what he will do. It's one of those things where there's a lot of talk about, saying, well, when they leave, I will. I'm not doing this without my race engineer, which is fair enough. But I'm kind of on the side of, well, the contracts are in place. And I know contracts are just pieces of paper. They're the kind of, the kind of thing that, as we've seen multiple times, even in the last few years, but, throughout the entire history of Formula One, people have disregarded contracts all the time. There's almost certainly like a sort of retirement clause sort of in it, and it just comes down to whether Max Verstappen wants to be paid or not. And it comes down to how much money is enough, because he's got kind of one of the more lucrative contracts in Formula One, to say the least. So it's one of those things where I'm on the side of, I think he'll stick around, to be perfectly honest. If he can do both, I mean, go and do the GT racing and do Formula One. It's kind of the thing I can kind of see him doing. He's in the position where, as people leave, he becomes one of the more senior figures in the team because of who he is. And, I'm going to call it the sort of, not reality distortion feel, but I feel like these big drivers like Hamilton, like Alonso, like Verstappen, the people that are just sort of regarded as greats in various ways, they have this sort of, gravity to bend the teams to their will a little bit. So you can go off and do, when the car's maybe so bad, maybe a bit worse. For example, with McLaren Honda, McLaren were seemingly happy to let Fernando Alonso go and do IndyCar instead of doing the Monaco Grand Prix. Could we maybe see that? I think Max sticks around because I just don't think that the enjoyment of GT racing, like, maybe I am wrong, like, maybe the enjoyment of GT racing is more than the money for him, and he would happily leave, for in whatever break clause or retirement capacity that there was. But I suspect that it isn't, and I think he will stay around. But on the other hand, stranger things have happened, and it's a kind of not vulnerable time, but it seems like that kind of time where anything is possible in terms of what Max Verstappen might do. Like, maybe he does go, you know what, I have proved everything I want to prove. I've, only been stopped by car performance. I have 4 world titles, beating basically everybody. I beat Lewis Hamilton, who is, statistically the best driver that there has ever been in Formula One. And I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to go and, enjoy my time with my family, where I can pick and choose the races I want to do. Because that's something you can do in GT racing and endurance racing, is you can go and, or any of the other racing that he's doing, is you can pick and choose, I'm going to do this race, I'm not going to do that race. And as much as any team would be lucky to have Max Verstappen in Formula One, any team is going to be lucky to have him in endurance racing or GT racing or whatever he chooses to do. In that way, the ball's in his court of what he wants to choose to do, but I think he's going to stay in F1 in some capacity.
Yeah, Max has definitely got options, I think it's fair to say. And you made a lot of good points there, especially with the GT come endurance racing calendar being quite flexible, with drivers being able to pick and choose the races that they do. So Max has got plenty of options. I think that's pretty obvious. So he'll end up somewhere. Me personally, I think he'll step away from F1, especially if the Red Bull doesn't improve. I think instead of seeking a move to another team, we've seen him, obviously he's doing the 24 hours of the Nürburgring this year. I could see him looking to enter maybe Le Mans when he moves away from F1. He's talked about wanting to do it with Alonso and maybe his own dad, something like that. So Max has got plenty of options. He's also very involved with his own team, which has rebranded from Team Redline to Verstappen Racing. So there will be elements of driver coaching and all the rest of it. And you can't ask for a much better driver coach than Max Verstappen, actually. But I'm also biased because I am a Max fan. Maybe he can come and teach me one day. Who knows? Maybe if we get, I don't know. Maybe if we get some nice 5-star reviews on this podcast, maybe Max will come and teach me how to drive. And speaking of which, segue, if you think the show does deserve a 5-star review, please do leave us one wherever you listen. A like, comment, subscribe, YouTube, all that good stuff. Yeah, that's definitely going off piece from the script, but I think we all know the score by now. Ruby, we've obviously spoken a bit about Max's future, but what about GP's future? I know that might sound like a bit of an odd question because we have just talked about him going to McLaren. He's going to McLaren to be the chief racing officer. That is his official title. So he'll be reporting directly into team principal Andrea Stella. So at the minute at Red Bull, he's head of racing and Max is race engineer, but his job is head of racing at the minute. So chief racing officer certainly sounds like a step up from where he is. Now, obviously, we don't know what that's going to entail exactly. But what do you think this means for his future? Do you think he's going to sort of move into like even more sort of managerial roles, where he can't get much more managerial than that, to be fair? But do you think this is potentially with a view to becoming, I don't know, a team principal in the future? Or what do you think this means for GP, like over, say, like the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, GP moving from Red Bull to McLaren to be their chief racing officer. You described it as a step up. It's definitely a step, potentially a stepping stone to team principality. It's one of those situations where he is reporting to the person running the team. In terms of progression, there's only one further direction you can go, and that is to the team principal fundamentally, unless you end up in one of those teams where they have a much more flatter leadership structure. McLaren obviously trying something like that previously and have kind of rescinded more to having Andrea Stella and Zach Brown leading the team in their own respective areas. And it sounds like Andrea Stella is actually taking on a lot more than he usually would as well. So one of the things that this does is take the pressure off Andrea Stella, particularly because F1 racing on a general weekend to weekend basis is getting incredibly complex and a lot more, requiring of that free brain space. And GP moving to McLaren, it's definitely, it helps the McLaren team because it now means that they have much more focused position in specific roles. It helps Andrea Stella, who we'll probably get to as well. It helps GP because it's another step on his career ladder, and more importantly as well, he brings a wealth of knowledge of how a recently successful Formula One team operates. We all remember the 2021 to 2024. There was still Red Bull success in 2024. 2021 to 2024 years, Max and GP winning races, winning championships, winning the season practically. And what I think it does is it cements GP. If he succeeds at McLaren, it cements him as another valuable asset in the Formula One retinue. And if he succeeds incredibly well at McLaren, it opens a lot of doors for him as well, particularly with that upwards progression. And whether that is team principal at McLaren or, team principal somewhere else, who knows? We'll see what happens. But yeah, I think it's a positive step for GP and something different as well.
Yeah, it's definitely something different. That's a very, very good way of putting it, and it's a big advance in his career. I agree with you. I think calling it a stepping stone is a very, very good way of putting it. As soon as you said that, I was like, that's a very good phrase. So I think, especially with, Andrea Stella, with rumours of him going back to Ferrari and all the rest of it, there's definitely scope for GP to move into that sort of team principal position. Owain, same question to you, mate. What do you think this means for GP, especially with his sort of future, as we just discussed about potentially being a team principal? What do you think he got that in his sights in the future? Do you think he would make a good team principal, or do you think he'd be someone who would perhaps be better off sort of being in a supporting role?
I mean, I think he's definitely, this is the natural progression of all race engineers, for the most part. That, we've seen this in various ways. Once you're up to the, on the race team side, engineering drivers and, engineering cars, or doing the strategy as well, it's kind of one of those things where, that's the natural point. Clearly he doesn't see that there's a route into being team principal at Red Bull, with Lauren Mecky's there. I also, I come back to what I said about maybe he doesn't see or think that it's going in the right direction. And what he's been told by McLaren is that is maybe more alluring. As a result of that, you have to either find a way to undermine your team principal to get them out, or you have to move. That's exactly the same thing that happened with Jonathan Wheatley. It's a tale as old as time in Formula One. Same thing with James Vowles. Like, you get to a certain point where once you've got a period of stability at the top of your team, if you have to jump ship elsewhere to get that promotion, get that, keep going up the ranks. In terms of that, I think it's sort of the only option available. Do you want to, you kind of either end up moving into a role supporting the Red Bull Young Driver program, that would flex some of the skills he's got in driver management, but also the team principal role, over at McLaren, should he eventually get it, is also flexing that set of skills. So I think, that's perfectly understandable why he would move there. It also allows McLaren to sort of scope him out, see whether he works within their structure. We've seen that not work for some engineers in certain ways, and they've had to, not had a demotion, but just move sideways within the business. So, from that perspective, I think that this is, it's that opportunity for McLaren to figure out who exactly that they're getting, and in that way, sort of almost mold him into the team principal that they want. Because, Andres, I don't know where he might go next, but, it's surely useful to have multiple sort of championship winning engineers in your team. And from that perspective, yeah, I can absolutely understand why he's going there. Being, obviously getting at the end of the day, it's still a promotion. It's more money ultimately. Let's not forget that these are careers for these people, and you have to move up if you want to keep making that sort of thing. So from that perspective, I think that's honestly GP's future. It's being sort of molded into the team principal role. I think his driver management skills, clearly with Max, second to none. And so from that perspective, that's something you've got to be able to do as a team principal. And this is also maybe an opportunity for him to learn, if he hasn't already, but learn maybe sort of some of the race operations side. But I think he's already got it sorted. It's kind of, it's a step up in name only, really.
Yeah. GP's probably already doing a lot of what he's going to be doing at McLaren. I think he's definitely thinking to the future. And you said it yourself, mate. There's probably not the scope for him to actually make that step up in Red Bull, especially with Laurent Mekies now coming in, and taking over as team principal. There's not really room at the inn, basically, for GP to go any further. And he's going to want to move away from being a race engineer because he's been doing it for so long. And, if he's head of this, head of that, and he's going to be chief racing officer, he's not going to be a voice that you're going to hear very often on the pit wall anymore, which, a bit like we said earlier with sort of Bono, it's one of those voices that is so synonymous with F1 now, but it is going to almost disappear, but he will still be there. He'll probably be trackside quite a lot. Yeah, I can see him moving into a team principal role. I mean, we can't say when because none of us have a crystal ball, sadly. I'd certainly be in a much bigger apartment if I did have one. And, there are a lot of options for GP, and he has to do what's right for him. I still think I think Max will go when he goes, but it's I suppose time will tell. One final talking point that we've got, Ruby. Like I said, obviously I will come to you first. What does this mean for Andrea Stella? Because we've just talked about GP potentially becoming team principal, and if that's in his sort of future plans and all the rest of it. Now, at the minute, well, I say at the minute, he's not even there yet. But when GP does go to McLaren for 2028, he will be reporting directly into Andrea Stella. So he will be almost at the very top of the management structure, apart from Stella and then obviously Zach Brown and then shareholders on top of that. If GP has aspirations to move into a team principal role, which I'm sure he would have discussed at length with McLaren during his negotiations or what have you, what does this mean for Stella? Is he going to stay in McLaren? Is he going to perhaps move to a different role? Is he going to maybe go back to Ferrari? Because let's not forget he is originally Italian. So this sort of opens up more questions than it answers. So what do you think Stella will do when GP moves to McLaren?
Yeah, I mean, GP's announcement of being headed to McLaren has certainly, I think, probably ignited the rumour mill that was already there. But there was a very strong sense of rumour that Andrea Stella would head back to Ferrari. Obviously, you mentioned he's started his career there, or at the very least his early career was over there. He was there between 2000 and 2014, performance and race engineers for various drivers, including Schumacher, Raikkonen, Alonso, But at the same time, the team have said that he's going nowhere at the moment. Ferrari would clearly benefit from having Andrea Stella in the team. They tried quite hard last year to get rid of Fred Vasseur and also to just get their drivers to shut up last season. And I feel like had they had Andrea Stella in that position, it would have been a very different story. I don't think there would have been as vocal, criticism of the team and the management had Andrea Stella been in the position that Fred was in last season. But, I think Ferrari would be lucky to have Andrea Stella back. I don't necessarily think it would be the right decision for Andrea at the very least, but personal reasons he might want to go back to a team based over in Italy, of course. But who says he has to actually go anywhere? Because Brown and Stella as a combination for McLaren have won back-to-back constructors, the most recent Drivers' Championship. So if you're McLaren, you'd want to seek to extend that relationship as long as is possible.
Yeah, that's the best way of putting it. It's something that is going to be probably a long and sort of fruitful partnership with McLaren. Stella, because unless Fred leaves Ferrari or moves into a different role, I can't see that changing anytime soon. This isn't football. We don't change the manager every 5 minutes when things start going wrong, unless you're Flavio Briatore. And, there are, people stick around in F1, people sort of become, almost part of the furniture, as we've seen, which is why it's such a monumental thing when someone in a senior sort of position leaves like this. Owain, same question to you. What do you think this means for Stella? Obviously, we've just talked about it very briefly. Do you think he'll stick around? Do you think he'll potentially start to move aside? Do you think it'll be a sort of handover period maybe for GP? What does this mean for his future in F1?
I guess it comes down to what does he want to do is the sort of thing, is this a signal? It's hard to believe that this is a signal from Zach Brown to Andrea Stella, maybe it's time to start moving on or something like that. That seems really weird if we think about it like that. So you've got to imagine that he's complicit in it, and maybe he doesn't want to do this anymore. But that seems kind of odd, and I don't see him necessarily, moving to Ferrari unless we get a big sort of. I know that it's talked about, but if we go by the contracts, Fred Vasseurs on a multi-year contract extension that was like that was agreed like last year. I know contracts are just pieces of paper. I've said it a couple of times this episode, but it's kind of perplexing, really, to have Andrea Stella, kind of he's at the highest role he can get to in McLaren. If you take out sort of Zach Brown's position as an option, which I don't see him sort of leaving or changing from. I don't personally see him going to Ferrari. Just going by what the contracts say. So it's kind of odd because I kind of expect a sort of natural progression from engineers upwards in the teams. And the real question is, where would he go? Is this maybe sort of, it could even be sort of an implicit admission that, well, maybe he's going over to Audi or somewhere like that. They say that they're not looking for a team principal, but, I don't necessarily believe it. I think the real answer is I do not know. It's the most perplexing part about this entire news story is that you've got this sort of, I'm going to liken it to a sort of kind of a conveyor belt or a production line, or a river where, you see this natural progression of engineers, starting through as trackside engineers, going to performance engineers, then race engineers, then maybe strategy, and then up into the team principal role. And once you hit the team principal role, if you get sort of a stability there, that's kind of a bit of a dam in that river. And what I don't see is anywhere that's sort of a natural way for Andrea Stella to of his own volition jump into the other role. So it's the thing that confuses me most. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Fred Vasseur is 57 and just has decided, what, I don't want to do this anymore. It's time to hang up my hang up my engineering sort of things and not be team principal anymore and move on. I don't personally see that happening, but maybe that's the case, and maybe he does go to Ferrari. But I just can't figure it out of where Andrea Stella would go or what he'd be doing if not the team principal role. This is kind of as high as he can go in McLaren, and I don't think there's anywhere. I don't see him going anywhere else from that perspective. So that's honestly my answer. I can't figure it out.
Yeah, there are a few places where he could go. It's one of those where I'm not sure what he would do. I mean, the only one that sort of springs to mind is when Binotto left Ferrari, where he was team principal, then he went to Audi and he became, I believe, CEO or something, when obviously Wheatley was there as team principal. That's another topic for another day. So it's, there is scope for him to move into potentially other roles, but it's whether he wants to, sort of step away from that team principal job and step into that maybe sort of like more director level role, and then sort of make room, because it's a tough gig, obviously, being in F1 and, sort of being sort of like the upper echelons of management and sort of having all that pressure on you, and it's going to take its toll. So there are plenty of things that some Stella could end up doing. I suppose we'll wait and see. We'll see what the next few years bring. So we're just going to wrap out the show then. As always, we give everybody a chance to plug anything. So Ruby, it comes to you first. If you've got any sort of socials or anything you want to give a shout out to.
Yeah, if people want to hear more from me and my unfounded Formula One opinions, they can find me on socials at Ruby Rose Price over on Instagram and the other meta ones. And otherwise, you can find me on YouTube at Ruby Price.
Lovely. Thank you, mate. Owain, same question to you. But not even a question anymore, is it? Anything you want to give a shout out to?
I just want to point out that it's going to be way more difficult. Not way more difficult, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult in the Grid Talk Prediction Challenge. 2 fewer races means there are 2 fewer sets of predictions, and that just makes it a little bit harder if you're trying to catch up. That's available on our Grid Talk social channels. That's available at Grid Talk UK on all the social media platforms with the app. And that is a little challenge we do where every race we do a prediction on what the outcome will be of that race for sort of pole, the podium, and the win, and then various other wild card sort of predictions. And like I say, 2 fewer races means that there's 2 fewer opportunities to try and catch up any points that you've missed. So it means that there's even higher stakes. Even higher stakes if you're ahead, or even if you're behind. You've got to get it right and maybe go a bit more crazy with the prediction. So make sure Make sure you keep tabs on that on our Grid Talk social channels. That's available at Grid Talk UK on all the social media platforms with the app.
Lovely, thank you. And then from me, yeah, just follow our socials, follow all that good stuff. And Grid Talk is available on YouTube as well as Amazon Fire, Spotify, Apple Music, Verbal, and Pocket Casts. Just search Formula One Grid Talk for our back catalogue of shows with previews and reactions to race results. A big thank you to Jared Bradley and Holly Eagle for supporting us on Patreon. If you want to support the show further, why not sign up to our Patreon for exclusive content? Make sure you subscribe so you know when each new episode is released. We will be back soon with plenty more F1 content, even during this enforced break we seem to have found ourselves in. Until then, thank you very much for listening to the Grid Talk podcast, and goodbye.